At 57, I never imagined that a man could feel so small, so suddenly invisible and yet still breathe. I never imagined that my own son, the boy whose first steps I cheered, whose scraped knees I bandaged, whose every birthday I remembered with painstaking care, could look at me, not with love but with the cold distance of impatience, and say words that would change my life forever. "Dad, it's time you live on your own." The sentence hit me like a stone thrown into a still lake. The ripples spread through my chest and my mind, and all I could do was stare. I wanted to respond, to argue, to cry, to beg. But the words didn't come. My throat felt raw, my tongue heavy. I realized in that moment that words were useless against the finality in his eyes. They were not angry. They were not cruel. They were simply firm. He had made up his mind. I walked to the closet in my bedroom. Everything I owned fit into a few bags now, but it felt like I was trying to pack decades of memories into a single duffel bag. I lifted an old photo album and paused. I lingered on a picture of him at 6 years old, perched on my shoulders, arms outstretched like he was flying. His laughter in that photograph seemed louder than the silence in the room around me. How had we gone from that to this? When I stepped outside, the evening air hit me like another punch. The sun was setting. The sky streaked with bruised purples and oranges. It should have been beautiful, but all I felt was hollow. Every house I passed seemed full of people who belonged there, full of voices that mattered, full of warmth that I had lost. And yet here I was, carrying nothing but a small duffel bag, standing alone on the sidewalk, unsure where to go. 2 days passed in a haze. I wandered the streets of my city, the familiar landmarks now strange and distant. Parks I had walked with him as a boy, streets I had walked home from work, cafes where we had celebrated. Little victories, all of them, now seemed like places I no longer belonged. Pride kept me from calling friends. Pride kept me from asking for help. Pride, that foolish thing, made me walk with my chest high even as it shattered inside. By the third day, hunger and fatigue were my constant companions. I bought the cheapest sandwich I could find, sat on a curb and chewed slowly, staring at people passing by. Some of them had children, some of them had lives that looked seamless, unbroken. I remembered the first time I had bought my son a bicycle. His eyes had sparkled with pure joy, and I had felt a pride that could have lit up a city. How quickly innocence faded, how swiftly loyalty turned into inconvenience. On the outskirts of town, where the asphalt ended and dirt paths took over, I found it, the old Quonset hut, half buried in weeds, its curved metal frame coated unevenly with cracked brown clay. It looked abandoned, forgotten by the world. Most people would have laughed, called it worthless. But I saw something else. I saw shelter. I saw opportunity. I saw a space that didn't judge me. A space that didn't demand my past or my wealth. A space that would allow me to be just me. The owner of the property leaned against a rusty fence post, eyeing me skeptically. $5. "Take it, it's useless anyway," he said with a shrug. $5. That was all it took to purchase what would soon become my sanctuary. The first night inside the hut was an experience I will never forget. The smell of clay, earth, and rust filled the air. The floor was packed dirt, uneven and cold. Cracks ran along the walls, letting the wind whisper in through tiny gaps. The stars were faintly visible through holes in the ceiling, and the moonlight cast pale silver shadows across the dusty floor. I lit a small lantern I had brought and sat on the only flat space I could find. My duffel bag lay beside me, and I felt a strange mix of despair and hope. I realized I had never been alone like this before. I had always been a father, a provider, a man defined by his responsibilities to others. Here I was just a man, nothing more, nothing less. And for the first time in decades, I felt the raw weight of being myself without anyone else's approval. The next morning I began cleaning. I mixed clay and water to patch the cracks in the walls. My hands became coated in mud, my nails black with dirt. My clothes, already thin and worn from days on the street, became another layer of grime. But with each patch I felt a strange sense of accomplishment. I was creating something, not for anyone else, not to impress anyone, just to survive, just to exist. I found small patches of soil outside the hut and began planting. Tomatoes, lettuce, a few carrots. It wasn't much. It wasn't fancy. But it was life. And life, in its most humble form, reminded me of who I was. Each morning as the sun poured its golden light across the clay walls, I could see the cracks glow, the shadows stretch. And I felt, despite everything when alive, I spent hours reflecting on the past, on my son, on the choices I had made. I thought about the nights I had spent working late shifts, the vacations I had skipped, the opportunities I had turned down, all for the sake of him. And yet here I was, discarded. The pain was sharp, but it was accompanied by clarity. I could not change what had happened. I could not reclaim the past, but I could shape my present brick by brick, patch by patch, day by day. Days turned into weeks. I slept under the stars through broken roof panels, warmed myself by a small fire I learned to make, and watched the world slowly become quieter around me. I learned to cook simple meals over coals, to fetch water from a nearby stream, to listen to the wind in the cracks of the clay walls. Every sound, every movement, every quiet moment became a meditation. It was in that silence that I began to understand something profound. My son had kicked me out, yes, but he had not broken me. He had not stolen my dignity. This clay hut, this small, humble, cracked place, was teaching me that life could be rebuilt even when it seemed impossible. I was learning that survival was not merely existing. It was transforming. One evening, I sat outside and watched the sun dip below the horizon. The sky turned a soft gradient of orange and violet. A cool breeze carried the scent of earth and grass. I smiled, a small, private smile. I realized that even without the comforts of my old life, even without the home I had built, I was free in a way I had never been, free from expectations, free from judgment, free to create, to live, and to simply be. The hut was more than shelter. It was my teacher, my mirror, my companion, and I knew that as long as I had my hands, my mind, and the courage to face each day, I could endure anything. I could thrive. At 57, I had been cast out, rejected, and alone. But in that clay-covered Quonset hut, I had discovered the first true spark of life I had felt in years. And in that spark, I saw the possibility of everything yet to come. The first morning in the Quonset hut felt strangely magical. The sun had barely risen, casting soft golden light over the cracked clay walls. Dust motes floated in the beams, drifting lazily like tiny spirits of hope. I stretched my stiff joints, letting the chill of the early air prick my skin, and for a moment I laughed quietly to myself. It was ridiculous, absurd even, to feel hope in a place so broken, and yet I did. After weeks of wandering the streets, sleeping wherever I could and feeling invisible, I realized that this hut, this $5 abandoned structure, offered me something the city had not: ownership. Not ownership in the sense of legal papers or deeds, but a deeper kind of ownership. Ownership of my time, my space, and most importantly, my life. No one could demand that I leave here. No one could judge me for being here. I began my work in earnest. First the walls. I mixed clay with water in a small bucket I found nearby, using my hands to fill the cracks in the hut. My fingers grew stiff and raw. My palms blistered from the constant friction against rough clay and rusted metal. Yet with each patch I smoothed over, I felt a small victory. The hut began to feel less like a shell and more like home. The curved walls, once harsh and alien, now seemed protective, a warm embrace of earth and history. Next, I turned my attention outside. The ground was uneven, overrun with weeds and small rocks, but I saw potential. I dug small plots using a stick in my bare hands and planted seeds I had brought with me: tomatoes, carrots, lettuce. I remembered my son as a child, running around our garden back home, asking endless questions about every plant, every bug, every leaf. I smiled to myself, feeling a strange mix of nostalgia and sorrow. Those memories once belonged to a home that had rejected me, but now in this hut they could live again. I started to experiment with small comforts. A wooden crate became a makeshift shelf. Pieces of scrap wood from nearby fences became a table. I even found a small oil lamp tucked in the corner of the hut. Its wick frayed and brittle, but it gave light when I needed it most. Every object I brought in, every small improvement I made, transformed this place. It was no longer abandoned. It was alive with intention, with my sweat and patience. The nights were the hardest. Alone in the hut with only the wind, the rustling of the clay, and the occasional distant dog barking, I felt the weight of my life's losses. I remembered my son's words, the finality in his voice, and the ache returned, sharper than ever. I imagined my old house, the warmth of its walls, the laughter I once heard echoing in its rooms, and yet I refused to dwell on resentment. Anger, I realized, would only paralyze me. Survival, even at 57, required clarity, focus, and humility. Gradually, the hut became a canvas for my resilience. I carved small niches in the walls to hold personal items. I hung a small cloth over a crack in the roof to block the wind. I even learned to collect rainwater, fashioning a small container from an old barrel I found nearby. Each day brought small victories. Each day reminded me that life, even when stripped of luxury, could be built anew. I began to see beauty in simplicity. The morning sun across the clay walls painted them in gold. The shadows of the curved roof shifted and danced with the hours, like a silent clock marking my progress. I would sit outside in the mornings, sipping tea I brewed over coals, and watch the birds and insects reclaim the land around the hut. In those moments, I realized how disconnected I had been from the natural rhythm of life. While pursuing a comfortable existence in the city, here, every breath felt authentic, every sensation raw and true. Food became a labor of love. I learned to prepare small meals from my garden. Lettuce with a simple dressing of herbs I discovered growing wild nearby. Roasted carrots over a small fire. Fresh tomatoes sliced and drizzled with a bit of oil I had saved from a nearby shop. Eating these humble meals felt like communion with the earth, a celebration of survival and patience. I marveled at how a place so unremarkable, by anyone else's standards, could sustain me so completely. As days turned into weeks, I noticed subtle changes in myself. My back, once bent with the years of office work and household labor, grew straighter from carrying water and hauling clay. My hands, rough and scarred, became a testament to persistence. My mind, previously clouded with worry and disappointment, found clarity in the routine of work and reflection. I was learning that dignity does not come from wealth, or recognition, or even family approval. It comes from action, from effort, from the quiet knowledge that you are building something with your own hands. The hut too seemed to respond to my presence. Small cracks I had patched expanded into smooth, unbroken surfaces. The clay walls held warmth longer each night. Even the floor, once cold and uneven, became bearable with the simple addition of straw and fabric I scavenged. I began to imagine extending the garden, planting more seeds, creating a small patch of life in a land that had seemed empty before. Each new sprout, each flower, each leaf was a reminder that life could flourish anywhere, given care and attention. I started talking to myself quietly, as a way to keep my mind active and accompany my loneliness. Sometimes it was advice: patch that crack, water the carrots, don't waste daylight. Sometimes it was reflection: you did well building this. Don't let the past steal this peace. Slowly, those conversations became part of my daily routine, a rhythm that connected me to the person I had always been and the person I was becoming. One afternoon, while tending the garden, I noticed the hut in a new light. The clay walls gleamed under the sun, the curved roof casting long, soft shadows across the earth. I stepped back, letting my hands rest on my hips, and felt a surge of quiet pride. The hut was no longer a forsaken structure. It was a home, my home. I realized that the man I had been before, defined by roles, responsibilities, and societal expectations, had been reborn in simplicity, solitude, and effort. I began to anticipate visitors, though not the kind I had known in the city. A neighbor stopped by one day, curious about the small garden. Another, passing through on a bicycle, waved and smiled. I learned the names of the birds that nested nearby, the insects that thrived in the soil, even the wind patterns that brought storms across the fields. The world, once vast and intimidating, had become intimate, personal, and alive. Despite the peace I had found, the memories of my son lingered. I thought of his face when he asked me to leave, the subtle way he had distanced himself, the way our shared home had transformed into a place where I no longer belonged. And yet anger did not linger long. I realized that my life was no longer dependent on his approval. His rejection had forced me to build something new, something authentic. And authenticity, I found, was more valuable than comfort, more durable than familiarity, more lasting than wealth. Weeks passed into months. The garden flourished. I had fresh vegetables daily, and the hut, patched and cared for, grew warmer and more welcoming. I spent hours outside, hands in soil, face turned to the sun, absorbing the rhythms of nature. Evenings were for quiet reflection, sipping tea while watching the sky change color, listening to the distant sounds of life beyond the fields. In this solitude, I discovered not loneliness but presence, not emptiness but richness. And slowly, imperceptibly, I changed. The man who had been dependent on validation and recognition became self-reliant, resilient, and quietly joyful. I laughed again at small things: the first sprout of a tomato plant, a bird dancing in the sunlight, the way the wind sounded when it passed over the clay walls. I began to understand that happiness was not something granted by others, but something nurtured with effort, patience, and love for what is real and immediate. I realized that being kicked out had been the cruelest kindness of my life. It had forced me to face myself, to confront the raw truth of who I was and what I could do. And in the quiet, clay-walled hut, with the sun warming my back and soil in my hands, I found not only survival but a kind of freedom I had never known. The Quonset hut, abandoned and cracked, had become my sanctuary. The garden, humble and unassuming, had become my pride. And in the rhythm of daily work, reflection, and care, I discovered a life I had thought lost, now reclaimed in every breath, every movement, every patch of clay I smoothed with my hands. It was here in this $5 hut that I learned the most valuable lesson. A home is not built from walls and roofs, but from persistence, love, and the courage to start again. And for the first time in years, I felt the quiet assurance that I could endure anything, rebuild anything, and create a life that was mine entirely, irrevocably mine. Months had passed since I first stepped into that clay-covered Quonset hut. The bitter sting of rejection, the hollow ache of being cast out by my own son, had softened into something else, determination. Every crack I patched, every seed I planted, every night I spent under the fragile roof had rebuilt me in ways I hadn't imagined possible. I was no longer the man whose identity had been tied solely to being a provider or a father. I had discovered the raw essence of self-respect, of independence, of quiet pride. The hut had transformed along with me. Its once abandoned walls now gleamed faintly in the sunlight. The cracks, carefully patched, had become almost invisible. Inside, shelves made of reclaimed wood held my few possessions. A small oil lamp, polished and filled, provided warm light in the evenings. Outside, the garden thrived. Tomatoes, lettuce, carrots, and herbs swayed gently in the breeze. Bees and birds frequented it, as though acknowledging the life that had returned here. Each sprout, each flower, each leaf was a small triumph, a tangible mark of effort and patience. It was a routine I had grown to cherish. I woke at sunrise, stretched my stiff muscles, and tended to the soil. I carried water from the nearby stream, patched any cracks that reappeared, and prepared simple meals from the produce of my garden. Evenings were for reflection, sitting outside with a cup of tea, listening to the wind whisper across the clay roof, feeling a kind of peace that had eluded me in the city. And yet, despite the tranquility I had built, the memory of my son's words never fully faded. I remembered the day he had told me to leave, the finality in his tone, the way our shared home had transformed into a place where I no longer belonged. The anger for a while had been sharp and immediate, but over time it had transformed into understanding. Not because he had been right to push me out, but because I had discovered that life's validation comes from within, not from the approval of others. One afternoon, as I was watering the garden, I noticed a black SUV slow down along the dirt path. My heart skipped. Visitors were rare in this part of the world, and I had grown accustomed to solitude. The SUV stopped and the driver's door opened. Out stepped my son. His posture was different. The confident stride, the assured expression, the slight smirk that had once irritated me, all replaced by hesitance, uncertainty, even a trace of shame. I watched him approach the hut slowly. He paused at the edge of the garden, his eyes scanning the small plot of thriving vegetables, the clay walls patched with care, the smoke rising from a small fire where I had prepared my evening meal. He looked at me, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, carrying the weight of months of separation, of unspoken words, of the slow, painful passage of time. "Dad," he said finally, his voice softer than I remembered. He glanced at the hut, at the garden, then back at me. I didn't realize you could do this." I smiled faintly. Not with bitterness, not with anger, but with the calm assurance of someone who had endured, who had rebuilt, who had found life beyond rejection. "Neither did I replied. He swallowed, as if he had rehearsed words that never seemed adequate. I thought you'd just, I don't know, give up." I shook my head. "You thought wrong." We walked slowly around the garden. I showed him the small irrigation system I had improvised, the carefully patched walls of the hut, the thriving plants that had emerged from soil, that had once been nothing but dust and weeds. His eyes widened slightly at the sight, at the quiet miracle of survival and resilience. "I spent weeks thinking about what it would mean to be on my own," I said. I was afraid at first, yes. Afraid I wouldn't manage, that I'd fail. But then I realized, failure isn't the end. It's part of the process. Every crack I patched, every seed I planted taught me something about myself, about patience, about persistence, about dignity. He nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of my words. There was a long pause as we walked, the dirt crunching beneath our feet, the wind whispering through the garden. Finally, he spoke again. I was wrong. I judged too quickly. I didn't appreciate what you'd done for me all these years. I looked at him, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that he finally understood. Sadness that it had taken months of separation for him to see. It's okay, I said. What matters is that we're here now. This place has taught me more about life than I ever learned in our house in the city. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find yourself again. He stayed silent for a while, watching me tend the garden. I noticed the subtle tension in his shoulders, the way he avoided eye contact, the hesitation in his steps. I realized that the roles had reversed. Once I had been the provider, the one guiding, teaching, and protecting. Now he was learning from me, not through lectures or commands, but through observation, through witnessing resilience, humility, and the quiet power of rebuilding a life from scratch. Days passed and he visited more often. At first, the conversations were awkward, stilted, filled with half-formed apologies and unspoken regrets. But gradually a rhythm developed. We worked together in the garden, fixed the walls, and even prepared meals side by side. There was laughter again, tentative, fragile, but real, and I realized that the bond we had lost had not disappeared. It had been buried, waiting for time, patience, and effort to bring it back to life. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and violet, I sat on a small wooden bench outside the hut. My son sat beside me, silent, watching the fireflies dance among the garden plants. "Dad," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady, I see now. I see what it means to build something with your own hands. I respect that." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's not about respect," I said. "It's about living fully even when life doesn't go as planned. It's about finding strength you didn't know you had and taking care of it. You can't always rely on others to give you that. Sometimes you have to claim it for yourself." He nodded, a subtle smile breaking through the lingering tension. "I hope I can learn that someday," he said. "You already have," I replied. "You just didn't realize it." In that moment, the hut no longer felt small or fragile. It felt like a fortress, not of stone or metal, but of perseverance, dignity and love rebuilt. The garden, the clay walls, the small fire crackling nearby, all of it represented the possibility of life after rejection, hope after despair, and connection after isolation. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. I continued to work in the hut, tending the garden, patching walls, refining my small routines. My son came and went, learning, observing, sometimes helping, sometimes silently reflecting. And in those months I realized the truth. Being kicked out at 57 had been the greatest gift I could have received. Not because it was pleasant or easy or fair, but because it forced me to discover the depth of my own resilience. The hut, humble and clay-covered, had become more than a shelter. It was a symbol of rebirth, of endurance, of quiet triumph. It was proof that life could flourish in the most unlikely places, that dignity could be reclaimed even after rejection, and that the human spirit could adapt, survive, and ultimately thrive. And as I sat there one evening, watching the sky shift from orange to deep indigo, listening to the soft hum of insects and the distant call of a night bird, I felt peace. Not the fleeting peace of comfort or wealth, but the enduring peace of a life rebuilt, a heart restored, and a connection renewed. I had been cast out. I had been rejected. But in the clay walls of a $5 hut, in the soil of a small garden, in the quiet rhythm of daily work, I had discovered something far more valuable than any house, any money, any approval could provide myself. And in that discovery, I realized something else. True home isn't where you are given space. True home is where you create it, where you nurture it, protect it, and let it grow. I had been given nothing, and yet I had everything.